All right. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are calling in from. My name is Sarah Spangeman. I'm the Director of Communications for the Crux Alliance. This webinar is focused on Turkey's net zero transition opportunities and challenges ahead of COP31. We are going to get started in just a minute, but I just wanted to go over a couple of logistics. First of all, everyone is on mute, but we do have a Q&A box. You should be able to ask questions there, and we will answer your questions once we start the discussion period. This webinar is being recorded, so just letting you know that, and we'll be able to share the recording after the webinar is done. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Joe Ryan, the Crux Alliance Executive Director, to kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Joe Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Crux Alliance. A quick word on Crux. The Alliance was formed in 2018. It is a collection of sectoral experts for the energy sector, and the objective of the Crux Alliance is to provide policymakers in the top emitting countries deep technical expertise at the moment when they are drafting climate regulation, with the rationale being that is when industry lobbying or incumbent interests are their strongest and coming with the deepest technical arguments for why the policy should not be designed or why it should be abandoned, why it should not be designed the way that would increase ambition and why perhaps that policy shouldn't be adopted in the first place. And so this is the alliance was formed to help level that playing field. Why don't I introduce Rabia Fahoki from INET, the International Network of Energy Transition Think Tanks. Rabia is the executive director there, and before that, she was, I believe, you set up the entire research program at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and so a long history of deep technical expertise in the energy space. And before I hand it over to Rabia, let me just say one of the reasons why we are hosting this webinar is we have found that the COP process offers there are lots of international discussions and declarations and proclamations, etc. But there are also opportunities for domestic policy change and domestic policy progress. And so we did this last year with Brazil to great effect, and we are very happy to do this for Turkey this year, hoping to identify domestic policies that Turkey can pursue and how we might best support those. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Fahoki. I'm sure I messed it up again. Rabia, please.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly about INET, but also about our valued member, SHURA. So we're starting with just a photo because it was in Mexico last year when IDEA, our member, hosted our annual forum. And really, for me, this picture captures this vibrant global community of think tank experts that come together for a few days, exchange ideas, learn from one another, and truly shape the priorities of the work program. So our mission is to connect the think tanks around the world to advance ambitious policy transition frameworks that align with the Paris Agreement and with the UN SDGs. So basically, what we've built is a trusted platform where we foster a knowledge exchange and dialogue for cross-pollination. We identify the synergies among the different think tanks, aggregate the policy expertise, and always grounded on data and evidence. Support institutional growth and facilitate to some extent financial access. So you see the snapshot on the right that gives you a few numbers, the think tanks, the kind of engagements, etc. But you can see that in later as well. So very briefly, the way the network is structured is around 6 working groups. In the next slide, thank you. With particularly strong engagement in the power systems, data, and industry transitions. However, we're integrating also broader enabling dimensions into the conversation, including finance, socioeconomic impact, and narrative building through comms. And if you see on the right, we have the activities, the types of engagement mainly focus on trainings and skills sharing, workshops and webinars, joint analytical policy projects, and many of which, as I said, do receive some support to encourage deeper collaboration between the members. And then we have a map. I'm not going to go through it, but it's just to show you the diversity. And I think that's one of INET's strength, the diversity of membership. So we have a wide range of energy transition experiences, policy approaches, and political economy. But of course, always keeping in mind that we identify best practice and solution that can be adapted and replicated in different national and regional contexts. Now, SHURA has been a member of INET since its inception and has consistently played a very active role in strengthening collaboration and knowledge exchange across the network. Through its engagement in several working groups like power, industry, data, it has really contributed valuable expertise and practical policy experience, and at the same time, fostered peer learning and cooperation. I think what is really important is that SHURA has contributed to the strategic direction of the network through Alkem being the director of SHURA and serves in INET's executive board. Now, in the past year, the collaboration has further strengthened by contributing to 2 major collaborative research projects. The first focuses on power market reform and renewables integration, together with Jesse from South Korea, SDPR for Pakistan, ERI from Thailand. So that's a joint research effort. And the second one explores industrial policy as a tool for industrial decarbonization and sustainable development, using Turkey as a case study. Now, beyond that, all the research and the policy work that SHURA has been doing, it's also instrumental in providing thematic advice and support to the forthcoming COP. But I'm sure Alkem will speak about that more, and will help organize INET events on power and industry transitions within the COP. And the last but not least is the fact that the annual forum this year is going to be hosted by SHURA. And I would like to thank Alkem so much for all the contributions SHURA has provided to the network and made it a lot stronger. Thank you again, and Joe, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Robbie. Yeah. And let me not take any more time. Let me turn it over to Alkem Bah, as Rabia said, director of SHURA in Turkey, and Philip Godran. Welcome, Philip. Philip is program lead for power at Agora Energiewende in Germany. I think we'll do a brief presentation and then we'll open it up for a curated conversation. So, Alkem, why don't I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Joe. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Let me share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So, yeah, today I would like to share some insights on Turkey's energy transition, where the country currently stands, and why the road towards COP31 represents such a critical moment. And my presentation will focus not only on opportunities, but also on the structural constraints and implementation challenges shaping the transition. Turkey is a large emerging industrial economy trying to accelerate energy transition under real-world economic, geopolitical, and social constraints. And precisely because of this, what happens in Turkey may carry lessons beyond Turkey itself. But before starting that, let me briefly introduce SHURA. SHURA is Turkey's first and only energy transition-focused think tank. We are an independent and non-profit platform hosted by Sabancı University in Istanbul and supported by international partners, namely Agora Energiewende of Germany and European Climate Foundation. Our work focuses on all aspects of energy transition, such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, electrification, grids and flexibility, market design, industrial transformation, and long-term net zero pathways. And we focus not only on the power sector, but also on the energy-intensive end-use sectors. And our work also bridges technical analysis, policy design, and stakeholder dialogue. So this is particularly important for Turkey because the transition is not only a technological issue, it is also an institutional, economic, and social transformation process. And thank you, Rabia, for your kind words. INET is an important partner for us. We work closely with international networks, one of the most important being International Network of Energy Transition think tanks. So to understand Turkey's transition, it is important to understand the country's broader economic and geopolitical context. Turkey sits at the intersection of Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, and also global manufacturing supply chains. It's a rapidly growing industrialized economy, and it is deeply integrated with European markets. Energy demand continues to grow rapidly. At the same time, Turkey remains highly dependent on imported fossil fuels. And this creates, first of all, energy security constraints, macroeconomic vulnerabilities, and growing competitiveness pressures. But Turkey also has significant renewable energy potential and increasingly strong industrial capabilities in clean energy technologies. And this combination makes Turkey a particularly important transition case. Because what happens here matters beyond national borders. And if Turkey can accelerate implementation under these constraints, it can become an important example for other emerging economies. I would like to start with Turkey's energy mix. Turkey's energy system remains heavily fossil fuel dependent. Fossil fuels still account for more than 80% of the energy mix. And import dependency is also extremely high. Imported fossil fuels account for 78% of the primary energy supply. Nearly all of the oil, most of the natural gas, 86%, and majority of the coal, 60%, is important. And this, of course, creates a structural vulnerability because Turkey is highly exposed to global commodity price volatility, geopolitical tensions, and external supply disruptions. This is one of the reasons why energy transition in Turkey is increasingly viewed not only as a climate issue, but also a matter of economic security and macroeconomic stability. And this is an important distinction because in Turkey, decarbonization is increasingly driven by economic necessity, competitiveness pressures, and energy security concerns. Yes, here you can see a graph on Turkey's trends in energy-related and total trade deficits, and also parallel to the the fluctuations in oil prices. Turkey's dependence on imported fossil fuels directly affects the trade deficit, inflation, and macroeconomic stability. Periods of high oil and gas prices strongly increase external vulnerabilities. At the same time, the European Union remains Turkey's largest export market with 41% share. So this means that CBAM is increasingly shaping Turkey's competitiveness outlook. In other words, the transition is no longer only about climate policy, but it is becoming a core economic strategy issue for Turkey. And this creates a difficult balancing challenge between affordability, competitiveness, and decarbonization. In terms of efficiency, energy efficiency, Turkey has achieved meaningful improvements over the past 2 decades. Until 2019, global energy intensity declined steadily while Turkey followed a more volatile trend. But after 2020, Turkey's primary energy intensity decreased faster than the global averages. But we see that in recent years, efficiency progress has slowed down. And in 2024, energy intensity actually increased slightly. This reflects several structural issues. First of all, one of the reasons is expansion of energy-intensive industrial production. It is a low value-added and very energy-intensive production mode in Turkey. Another reason is rising cooling demand and also growing household consumption in line with the subsidies in Turkey. This matters because demand growth is increasingly absorbing the gains achieved through renewable deployment. This is why we place strong emphasis on energy efficiency, demand-side management, electrification, and industrial transformation. Industry is one of the main bottlenecks in Turkey's energy transition, I must say. It directly accounts for roughly 30% of final energy demand, but also if we include indirect effects such as transportation and services, it accounts nearly for 50% of final energy. So today, Turkey's industrial structure still relies heavily on energy-intensive, relatively low value-added production, and this creates several interconnected challenges with energy demand and emissions growth, competitiveness pressures, and macroeconomic vulnerabilities. This is why Turkey's transition cannot be reduced only to renewable deployment. It also requires industrial upgrading, balancing economic value added and energy use. It requires electrification, efficiency improvements, and a shift toward higher value added production. That's why, in many ways, industrial transformation sits at the center of the Turkey's net zero path. On the other hand, when we just look at the power sector, we see that the transition has moved fastest there. Renewable deployment has accelerated significantly. Almost all new installed capacity is coming from renewables in the last 4 or 5 years. So Turkey has already demonstrated a large-scale renewable deployment capability. Today, we have 122 gigawatts of installed capacity. 62% of this installed capacity comes from renewables, and 43% of power generation is supplied by renewables. Wind and solar accounts for 21% of power generation, 40 gigawatts, and Turkey has ambitious targets to triple this capacity to 120 gigawatts by 2035. So Turkey already has a large investor ecosystem, strong EPC capabilities, domestic manufacturing, and experienced developers. This is important because Turkey is no longer at the stage of asking, can renewables scale? The answer is clearly yes. The real question now is, can this system integrate renewables fast enough? And that brings us to the next phase of transition. System integration. This is perhaps the most important transition challenge going forward globally and also in Turkey. Turkey has largely solved the renewable deployment challenge, and the next challenge is integrating renewables at system scale. Of course, this requires grid expansion, flexibility options like storage, interconnections, demand-side management, and digitalization. And this is where the transition becomes much more system-oriented. Turkey has a roadmap for green transmission infrastructure as well. So it has a target, an investment target of $28 billion for until 2035, with some targets on building new lines, increasing interconnection capacity, simplifying permitting processes, assigning more capacity to renewables. So the targets are there, but we will see the success will depend on the implementation capacity. And this is also where international cooperation and investment can have particularly high impact. Another important topic is electrification for Turkey, because it remains one of the biggest untapped accelerators in Turkey's energy transition. Electricity still accounts for only about 20% of final energy consumption, similar to the global trends. And progress remains relatively slow in transport, heating, and the industry, but the potential is also very large. So we have considerable potential, electrification potential in industry, especially in sectors like that requires low temperature, like food, chemicals, and textiles. Indirect electrification solutions like power to X will be important for hard to abate sectors like cement. For buildings, Turkey has high capacity for heating pumps in coastal regions, and for transport, the sales of electrical vehicles charging infrastructure is accelerating. But there is this high potential is not utilized at the moment. So we clearly need clear sectoral targets, pricing reform on electricity and gas, and targeted incentives. So in short, actually, Turkey overcome many of the challenges related to supply sides. But the real challenge remains in managing demand today. Demand is growing rapidly, and over the last decade, final energy demand increased almost twice as fast as the global average, 29%. So as a result, emissions continue to rise, and renewable expansion alone is not sufficient. This is one reason why Turkey's unupdated NDC still implies higher emissions in 2035 compared to today's. And at the same time, this demonstrates that supply-side transformation alone is not enough, and structural demand-side transformation becomes essential for Turkey. So if we just summarize opportunities and challenges, main opportunities, Turkey has a net zero target embedded in midterm policy documents. We have a strong renewable energy potential and implementation capacity with local manufacturing capacity of wind and solar equipments, skilled technical works, policy and market design experience, and it's, in a strategic, the country is in a strategic geographical position at the intersection of global manufacturing supply chains. But we have challenges as well. First of all, long-term pathways are not clear, especially the period after 2035 is not clear. We don't have a clear target or roadmap regarding transitioning away from fossil fuels. This is another gap in the Turkish energy transition. Another challenge is the need for a structural industrial transition beyond green and digital transition. We need improvements in energy efficiency and electrification. Turkey has some policy and institutional coordination challenges, as in many other countries. And of course, one of the biggest challenges is finance. All of these investments require substantial financing. Decarbonizing the power sector alone requires an annual investment of $15 billion through 2053. So I can say that Turkey combines strong structural drivers and real delivery capacity, but the core issue is bridging ambition and implementation. So far, Turkey has largely solved build challenge, building renewable energy capacity. Of course, there is room for improvement, but I think the progress so far is good. The real challenge now is whether Turkey can achieve a system-level transformation. The grid, demand side change, and integrated planning required for that. So yes, COP31 it creates a potentially important strategic moment for Turkey, not simply because Turkey is hosting the COP, but because the global climate discussion itself is evolving. The next phase is increasingly about implementation, system integration, industrial transformation, grids, electrification, and finance. And this aligns very closely with Turkey's own transition needs. Therefore, COP31 can create an opportunity to accelerate Turkey's own energy transition, strengthen international cooperation, and align policy and investment priorities. And at this point, support really matters because one important lesson from energy transition processes globally is that implementation requires strong institutions. So independent analysis, stakeholder dialogue, policy design, knowledge transfer all matter enormously. And this is where organizations like SHURA try to contribute. And this is also where international cooperation can play a particularly important role. Yes, thank you very much. This is all from my side. I will be happy to answer your questions, if any.
Thank you, Alchem. Philip Godron is our discussant. Do you want to kick us off, Philip, for our conversation?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Alchem, for this impressive overview on Turkey's pathway and also some of the work that SHURA has been doing. Talking about SHURA, and I can say that because I was also involved in the thinking of developing SHURA at the early stages, but I'm far away now.
You are in our hearts,
Still,
so Philip.
SHURA has, I would say, established itself as the go-to place for questions around the energy transition in Turkey since it was founded. Could you elaborate a bit more on the way SHURA operates in obviously sometimes challenging political context of Turkey, whom you are addressing in your work, with whom you are cooperating, where are the hard nuts to crack, and also maybe shed a bit of a light on the particular role of SHURA's advisory council?
Okay, thank you, Philip. Yeah, since its establishment in 2017, SHURA has become a trusted reference point in Turkey's energy transition debate. And one of the reasons is that we try to position ourselves not as an advocacy organization for a specific technology or stakeholder group, but as an independent evidence-based platform focused on implementation-oriented solutions. Turkey's energy transition is taking place in a very dynamic and sometimes complex political and economic environment. And energy policy here is closely linked not only to climate policy, but also to energy security, industrial competitiveness, affordability, and geopolitics. So our approach has always been to acknowledge these realities and work within them rather than treating the transition as a purely environmental discussion. Operationally, SHURA is fully independent. We rely on philanthropic funding, and we do not work directly for the government institutions or private sector actors. And that independence is extremely important because it allows us to choose our own research topics and publish findings transparently without external pressure to shape conclusions in a particular direction. But at the same time, I must say, independence does not mean isolation. On the contrary, stakeholder engagement is at the core of how we operate. So we work extensively with ministries, regulators, the system operator, distribution companies, sector organizations, and financial institutions, universities, and the civil society. And our role is to create a credible analytical space where different stakeholders can discuss difficult transition questions using a common evidence base. And in terms of whom we address, our audience is actually quite broad, as I mentioned. Of course, policymakers are an important audience because many of the issues we work on require regulatory and policy evolution. But we also work very closely with the private sector because the implementation capacity in Turkey is largely driven by private investment and industry. And increasingly, we also engage with international actors because Turkey's transition is becoming much more connected to global discussions around CBAM, green industrial policy, climate finance, and supply chains. And I would also emphasize that SHURA is intentionally designed as a dialogue platform, not only as a research institution. And this is where SHURA's advisory council plays a very important role. Our advisory council brings together prominent individuals from Turkey's energy ecosystem, business, academia, civil society, and the financial sector. And the purpose is not governance in a formal sense, but rather creating a space where different perspectives can challenge and enrich our thinking. And it helps us to stay connected to the practical realities, political sensitivities, and implementation barriers within the Turkish energy system. I think this multi-stakeholder structure is one of SHURA's key strengths. And especially in a transition process as complex as this one, technical analysis alone is not enough. So you also need trust and dialogue and the ability to translate analysis into realistic, implementably, and politically relevant pathways.
Thanks a lot, and really impressed with how even in sometimes, let's say, tense political environments, you do manage to bring all these stakeholders that come with different backgrounds, different interests to the table. And that to me seems one of really the core strength to provide this platform. You did talk about the circumstances that you're operating in, and one circumstance that really comes to mind for many of us operating in the energy sector these days is obviously the escalation of the war in the Middle East and the following energy price crisis, which obviously is driven by a rise in fossil gas. And it's something many of us are concerned with, certainly not only in Turkey, but particularly in Turkey, given the close geographical proximity, but also, let's say, the political and economic relations that Turkey has with the region. Can you share a few thoughts on how this recent energy crisis has affected Turkey's energy system and economy? And building on that, do you see ways to leverage opportunities for accelerating the transition coming from this challenging situation under the headlines of a resilient system, a resilient economy and society?
Yes, Philip, as you mentioned, this crisis also it has significant effects for Turkey because of the reasons I mentioned during my presentation. In the short term, Turkey is not expected to face major physical disruption in oil or in natural gas supply. One reason is that Turkey's oil and gas imports are relatively diversified, and our direct dependence on routes through the Strait of Hormuz is more limited compared to some Asian economies. However, the real risk comes through global markets and prices. So we already experience significant increases in energy prices in Turkey, although we have substantial subsidies, and this is creating a lot of pressure on the treasury. If tensions around the Strait of Hormuz escalate further for Turkey, that matters enormously because of its dependence on important fossil fuels. We actually experienced something similar during the 2022 energy crisis, and high fossil fuel prices rapidly translated into a huge trade deficit, current account pressures, inflation, and also broader macroeconomic instability. So even without a direct supply cut, Turkey remains highly exposed economically. And there are also important natural gas implications. Turkey has increased LNG imports and diversified supply sources in recent years, which improves flexibility. But at the same time, the growing share of spot LNG means greater exposure to volatile global LNG markets. And there is also another important layer here. Climate and geopolitics are increasingly interacting. Turkey has reduced natural gas use in electricity generation over recent years thanks to the growth of renewables. But in dry years, when there is drought, lower hydropower generation often pushes the system back toward higher gas consumption. So hydrological risks can also increase exposure to geopolitical gas risks. This is why I think this crisis actually reinforces the strategic importance of accelerating the clean energy transition. Of course, during crisis time, there are two aspects. On the one side, parties are more cautious, actually, towards decisions like fossil fuel phase out because energy transition concerns are accelerated. But on the other hand, it clearly displays us how vulnerable our economies to such crisis and such disruptions, and that energy transition is not only a climate agenda, but also an energy security and affordability agenda. And this is absolutely true for Turkey. Now, energy transition is not only a climate solution, it's increasingly becoming an energy solution, and this is recognized more and more by the stakeholders in the energy ecosystem. So, as I said, I think what is required in the next phase, especially while we are going to COP, is that to just emphasize this narrative about energy transition. How does it strengthen energy security? How it reduces economic vulnerability, and also concentrate on the next phase requirements, such as stronger transmission infrastructure, because it's one of the main bottlenecks globally as well now. Renewables are expanding rapidly, but transmission infrastructure is not expanding as fast as the renewables. Electrification, energy efficiency, industrial transformation, these are all very important topics that should be addressed during COP31. And on research and data.
Can I briefly come in, Alkem, on that one? Indeed, and then Sarah, I'll hand over because I already see that there's plenty of questions by the audience. I don't want to stand within there. If you share one or two examples, what your concrete plans are in the run-up to COP, how you plan to engage with ministries, and which themes you think could resonate with the administration when preparing COP and running and giving Turkey a constructive role in the process. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Philip. So the action agenda is not published yet, but the main themes in the forefront is number one is electrification. Then grids and flexibility, smart systems and digitalization, climate resilient and sustainable buildings, green industrialization. These are essential topics around clean energy transition within the COP agenda. And these teams, most of these teams align very closely with our work for several years. And in fact, we would like to concentrate especially on electrification and grids, and we believe these two themes will become the defining themes for COP31. And at SHURA, we are already shaping our publications and communication activities around not only these two themes, but all the energy transition themes that I have mentioned. And this year, much of our communication strategy is designed to support the COP31 process. For example, we are preparing our YouTube programs, our publication series around these themes in order to increase visibility and public discussion around the key priorities of energy transition. And once the action agenda becomes clearer, we plan to deepen our content production further through policy briefs, articles, and implementation-oriented recommendations. We are also trying to communicate these issues through different formats and audiences, through interviews, digital content, and podcasts, and joint events with international stakeholders. Our objective is not only to produce knowledge, but also to contribute more actively to policy discussions and implementation-oriented dialogue And we are in touch with the ministries through bilateral exchanges and through stakeholder meetings. We are sharing our recommendations for the action agenda and trying to contribute constructively through evidence-based analysis. And importantly, we are also ready to support, if needed, capacity building and technical cooperation in some of these priority themes, especially electrification, grid flexibility, and industry.
Thanks so much. Really made me wanna travel to Turkey in November.
Hopefully.
Many good reasons to do so. Back to you, Sarah. Looking forward to further discussion.
Thanks, Philip. There are some fantastic questions. And if we don't get to all of them, I popped an email for Esra Eaglemiz in the chat, and she is the comms director for SHURA, and she can help facilitate your questions. But there's been a few questions about electrification. So there's a question about what policies has Turkey already adopted to promote electrification, and sort of what the will is behind that, if there's political will for that, and then relatedly, the potential for a electrification target as a pledge at COP31, and sort of how could Turkey support this? Would they support this? And then I'll just tag on a related question if you can get to it, since I'm bundling some questions together, is what about battery supply chains, and the ability for Turkey to have does it have its own sort of ability to process rare earths? Does it have a rare earth supply chain, that kind of thing? So go ahead. Thank you, Alcom.
Okay, so starting with electrification, as I say, the current share is around 20% in final energy consumption, and we have some official targets. The 2035 target is 25%. Clearly, there is a room for improvement in this target because according to our studies, it should be at least 30%. And we have some policy recommendations how to increase it and accelerate it to minimum 30%. And for 2053, it's 56. The target is 56% in line with Turkey's net zero target. So far, in terms of policies, actually, not much has been done. Of course, there are some, let's say, regulatory changes, but still, as I mentioned during my presentation, this potential is untapped. So first of all, for Turkey, I think the medium-term targets should be increased, definitely. And also, I think COP31 should be a place where a global electrification target should be discussed. I expect this from this COP, definitely. And that electrification should be recognized as one of the main pillars of energy transition, supported by a visible coalition of governments. For Turkey itself, I mean, this is really, there are, with small regulatory changes, with some target-oriented incentives, we can progress really rapidly with some adjustments on the subsidies on natural gas versus electricity, for example, with some incentives, regional incentives for some, for example, for heat pumps, it can be accelerated quickly. So this electrification issue is very relevant both for Turkey and for globally as well, and for sure it will be one of the main themes in the COP31 agenda. And about the battery supply chains, it's also one of the most, let's say, important topics under discussion, because now we have, renewable capacity is extending, and the government has assigned a huge capacity, more than 30 gigawatts of capacity for batteries integrated to wind and solar parks in Turkey. And installations started, actually. It is going a bit slower than expected, so it should accelerate, certainly. And as SHURA, we are also proposing some solutions, especially for aggregators and also for prices in the market, some market reforms. It will be important. And in Turkey, there are several companies that are producing batteries domestically. But of course, it is difficult to compete with China. So it's a problem as well. In Turkey, usually we do have some local content incentives, and this is how these industries are developing. And for batteries, the same system will go on for a while. But at the end of the day, of course, the supply chains, access to rare earth minerals, it's an important topic that Turkey should also address and also define its own strategy.
Thank you. A couple of questions around demand, the topic of demand. One question is on data centers and if the growth of AI is going to increase demand from data centers. And then in terms of residential demand, another question about smart meter transformation and if Turkey is considering something to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah, data centers is also at the core of the energy transition agenda for Turkey. So on the one hand, it increases efficiency, but on the other hand, it of course creates a huge electricity demand. So a lot of organizations working on that, and the government itself, the Ministry of Energy, is also working on that. So it is again linked to infrastructure. Again, it is linked to grids, because we will need even more renewable energy capacity with, data centers, cooling needs, the electrification. We're talking about the acceleration of electrification. This will require much more renewable capacity integrated to the system. And now Turkey's grid has a very strong foundation, actually. But the problem is that most of these new capacities are coming from distributed solar installations. So modernization of the distribution grids, digitalization, these are all very, very important topics. And it's already difficult. Turkey is having some hard time to manage in managing dispatch. It is safe for the moment, but certainly we have to do more on the infrastructure, on the grids part. And as you have mentioned, of course, all this transition requires smarter systems. Smart meters is a part of this. And yes, Turkey has a target to increase exchange the meters with smart meters. So it has some targets and it will start implementation soon.
Great. Okay. Another question about the Santa Marta conference and the pledge to develop roadmaps transitioning away from fossil fuels. And you noted that Turkey does not yet have this kind of roadmap. Do you see hosting COP as an opportunity to sort of focus the need for such an agenda in Turkey?
To accelerate this discussion in Turkey, right?
Yeah.
Is it the question?
Yeah.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's as I said, Turkey has a net zero target, but this has not yet translated into a clear fossil fuel phase-out calendar, especially for coal, which is a big gap, actually, because it creates some question marks on how to achieve net zero after 2035. And there is a resistance in Turkey. I wouldn't frame it only as a political choice, but it is also linked to energy security concerns, industrial competitiveness, affordability, and employment in coal-dependent regions. But the absence of a clear timeline, of course, creates uncertainty. From our perspective, the important next step is not only announce a date, but develop a credible roadmap, how much clean capacity is needed, what grid investments are required, how reliability will be maintained, and how affected workers and regions will be supported, and how finance will be mobilized. These are all questions that should be addressed, and we work on these questions. So clearly, Turkey needs more clarity on that. And it is important because the phase out must be planned now in a way that is technically credible, social fair, and economically manageable. So what I hope is that, first of all, during COP, to recognize that renewable energy and electrification is already accelerating and it can be rapidly scaled up. And to establish a roadmap that links the phased reduction of fossil fuels with this expansion of renewable energy and electrification would be nice. So yes, I hope this would be a moment where Turkey can also leverage its own internal policies in line with its own net zero pathway.
Thank you. So many great questions. I'm just looking here. And one, maybe we could talk about two sort of related questions. One, which relate to what you were just speaking about, actually. Is there, because of the energy crisis right now, is there any risk of new coal? Is there talk of that at all? New coal, investments in new coal as an energy security measure? And then alternatively, there was a question about sort of what kinds of just transition policies might be needed to make sure that we can actually deliver on the groups that you're speaking of, the civil sectors.
Okay. So I'm not expecting a new coal capacity in Turkey because it's not economically viable anymore. It's not feasible. Most of the coal capacity is supported through subsidies, government subsidies, and financing. I mean, finding finance is another problem. So I am not expecting new coal capacity for sure. In terms of just transition, the lack of coal phase out or fossil fuel phase out plan is a problem, to be honest, because this prevents the issue to be planned in a comprehensive manner across all dimensions. Of course, there are studies. Also, the government is preparing its national just transition strategy. So this is something in the agenda of the Ministry of Energy and other related ministries for sure. But we need more clarity on that. So we also work on just transition. Today, the concentration is more on the new sectors, requirements for training, etc., for new job creations. But at the same time, we have to plan what kind of changes will happen in the fossil fuel dependent sectors. We are working on that, and actually the ratio is not huge. For instance, the share of employment working on coal sector, on coal mines, is 0.2% of total employment, but the issue is that it concentrates on certain regions and certain districts. So just transition policies should be integrated into the regional development plans. There is a huge need for analysis and also roadmaps for these regions.
Thank you, Elkim. We're at time, but that was such a wonderful presentation. I learned so much. I'm sure everyone who joined learned so much as well. Thank you, Philip, for kicking off our discussion. Thank you, Inet and Rabia for host or co-hosting with us. And we look forward to hosting future events in person and virtually in the not too distant future. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you very much. Thanks.